Welcome to Myth Informed. I'm your host, Brian Edward. Off camera is Sean Frasick, who will be joining us because we are sans and engineer right now, so we're double dutying. But I'm excited for our guest today, Jack Posobiec. He is a correspondent for One America News Network. In 2016, he was the Special Projects Director for Citizens for Trump, which is the largest Trump grassroots organization in the United States. Jack is a veteran intelligence officer of the United States Navy, served multiple deployments overseas. Originally from Philadelphia, Jack resides in Washington, D.C., where he's the bureau chief there, with his wife, Tanya, and their young son, who we might see running around on camera, possibly. He has written 2 nonfiction books, Citizens for Trump, The Inside Story of the People's Movement, and To Take Back America, and 4D Warfare, a doctrine for a new generation of politics. He also dabbles in comic books. You can see Poso behind there. It's actually kind of cool. I don't know too much about it, but I saw some of the artwork and it looked cool. Welcome, Jack.
Brian, thank you so much for having me, guys. I really appreciate being here. I appreciate all the stuff you guys do. Yeah, we're, I'm kind of branching out into the comics world. I've always wanted to, I grew up reading comics as a kid. And now that I'm a little older, I have a little more life experience, some more stories to tell. I found that comics are a great way to tell those stories to the next generation. And, I've got my own son now. He's 1.5. He's not quite at the age where he'll be able to, follow along with the storyline or anything like that. But he'll be able to understand the pictures and the artwork. And so actually the team that put it together is Chuck Dixon, who wrote Bane, he created Bane for the Batman comics. He actually was the creator of Birds of Prey, or one of the creators, not the movie, of course, the comics. and so he and Brett Smith, who's also done a ton of work in the comics world as an artist, both approached me and said, Jack, we want to do a comic kind of based around you and talk about geopolitics and talk about things that are going on in our world or things that might be going on in a sort of what of scenario. But take sort of the labels out of it, take the parties out of it, take current candidates out of it, and just sort of talk about different trends in geopolitics. And they said, we think your brand would be really cool. So I'm getting a graphic novel written about me, and my family's in it too. So my wife's in it, my son's in it, and it's kind of an amazing experience. But it's really cool to see that the market is there for it. Because so many people who consider themselves conservatives or Christians or Trump supporters, etc., have checked out of Hollywood by and large, they do still have a desire for good stories and good storytelling. It doesn't mean they don't want this type of cultural output. And, politics is downstream from culture. Andrew Breitbart always said that. So you got to go to the culture first if you ever want to actually change anything.
Yeah. So that really makes sense to have your foot in there. So how did you get from naval intelligence officer? When did you get interested in politics? How did you get behind Trump? Some people say, man, this guy is totally backing Trump. How'd that start?
Yeah, so I was involved in politics when I was in college. I did, some debate groups. I did some other political organizations, ended up kind of going the Republican route and working for some candidates, working on campaigns. And then I just got sick of it. I got totally fed up with being part of, this was like RNC establishment type politics. So sick of it because we would win elections, then nothing would happen, right? We'd get our people in office and nothing would change. So I got sick of it and I just kind of rage quit. I moved to China for a couple of years, worked at the Chamber of Commerce there, and then came back and joined the Navy because I was still looking for something to do that still interested me. And I was totally checked out of politics. 2008, 2012, I voted for my dad for president. And then Trump came along, and I loved the disruption. I just loved the way that he was upending everything. He was talking about issues that people didn't usually talk about. Instead of meeting the normal delta of political issues, and on that battlefield, he created an entire new field of argument and debate and topics that nobody was even talking about. They used to call these things the third rail of politics. Well, instead of, not just touching them, he rushed up, charged it, and grabbed these third rails, like outsourcing, like immigration, right, like borders. and just made that his entire mantra, his entire campaign. Plus, American entanglement in foreign alliances, America's endless wars overseas, having been in the military actually kind of made me a little bit more woke to just exactly what it means for America to be at war or involved in military conflicts in so many spheres across the globe, and whether or not that really makes sense or helps the American people back home. In fact, I think it gives me a different perspective on it than most, because being in the Navy, you really can see all the different facets of the American expansive umbrella across the world, and wondering why it is that we're spending so much money to upkeep a system that was largely set up post World War II during the Cold War, when the geopolitical situation in the world looked a whole lot different than it looks like today, and whether the vestiges of this system that still exist are actually make sense or actually have efficiency, or are efficient for solving the problems that they were set up to actually deal with in the first place.
Right. What do you say to the argument that if we're not over there, if we don't have a substantive presence in a number of countries, then terrorism will find its way over here?
Yeah, I mean, I would go back and say, did they say that thing about the Nazis and the Japanese? Because we're still in Germany and Japan, right? They say that about the North Koreans because we're still in Korea, right? It's been this sort of American mantra in military policy, where once we make a substantial move to make war on another country or on another part of the world, that we end up just staying there, and there's never any pullback, there's never any reduction in force numbers, and it ends up being very lucrative for all the companies involved, certainly all the defense contractors and all the suppliers that go towards that military effort, not just feeding and clothing, but also when you're talking about in terms of fuel, in terms of movement. There's so much money that goes on. You look at the cost of an aircraft carrier in some of these cases, and how many cost overruns they go for it. And so you realize that there's a whole industry that's set up in America that's feeding off this system. And as far as the security situation, the U.S. and Taliban are, or maybe are, signing a peace deal pretty soon here. They're talking about moving together in Qatar and putting something together. And I saw some people were saying, well, we need to stay in Afghanistan, and using that same logic, if we don't go and fight them over there, they're not going to fight them over here. Okay, the Taliban didn't do 9/11, right? 9/11 wasn't conducted by them. They gave some smattering of support to bin Laden while he was over there, and his organization was involved in all these things. But you look at the vast number of terrorist attacks that have taken place since 9/11, and certainly that have taken place within the United States, it hasn't been 9/11 style attacks that were conducted by overseas organizations or people traveling from overseas to the U.S. What they've done is they use the internet to recruit people within the United States, either directly or for, through self-radicalization, this kind of lone wolf, or I actually call it the fan base effect, that someone becomes a member of the ISIS or Al-Qaeda fan base, and then they want to go and show their commitment, so they commit an attack. You saw this to an extent with the Boston bombers. However, the Boston bomber situation is a little bit different because you do have foreign travel there, and that's a whole nother tangent. But some of the largest attacks that have taken place in the United States since 9/11 haven't been from groups like Al-Qaeda. They've been from people self-radicalizing on the internet.
Yeah. Like Anwar al-Awlaki is radicalizing people on YouTube, and he's been dead since 2004 or something like that. A terrorist leader, or at least an ideological Islamist leader. So I think when you attack terrorism, you have to go for the underlying ideology, or else we're going to get tons of lone wolves.
Right. So, and if you don't discredit the ideology, then it almost doesn't matter if you clean up the group. This isn't a policing action, right? This isn't like you go after the leaders and it just falls. It's not the mafia, right? It's an idea. It's an ideology that you need to discredit. You need to mock. You need to take away any legitimacy that idea has, and then you can make it, sort of not be able to find any support anymore, right? You make it not cool to be a member of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, but when you demonize them, you show that the United States is so upset about it, then it actually has a reverse effect than what you're actually seeking to achieve, because they say, oh, well, the United States is so mad about us because we're so big, because we're such a threat to the United States, come join us and we'll go fight America. And a lot of Americans who haven't spent substantial time overseas don't really understand that America is seen as like the rich kids that live in the gated house at the end of the block by the vast majority of people in this world.
Yeah.
And so no amount of virtue signaling is ever going to change that perception.
Yeah.
One of the problems I see with it, like being able to talk and attack the ideology of Islamism is you'll get blasted with being an Islamophobe.
That's right.
Right. And I
Yeah.
would see the Obama administration talking to CARE, like the Council for Islamic Relations, a lot. Like, I don't see that so much with the Trump administration. Who are like the Muslim representatives? Does he have a more moderate, more American-centric crew? Or how's he dealing with that?
Well, so what's really interesting is you started, like, you go back to 2015, 2016, and you heard Trump was an Islamophobe, Trump is an Islamophobe, Trump's doing the Muslim ban. But now you fast forward to 2020, and what you're hearing is, oh, Trump and Saudi Arabia are too close. Trump's too close with the Saudis. Trump is in bed with Mohammed bin Salman, MBS, right, the Crown Prince over there. And so it's this weird situation where Trump said, okay, well, what if I deal with the leaders of these countries? I'll deal with the King of Jordan. I'll deal with the King of Saudi Arabia. He'll work with other people in the group that are part of the GCC, the Gulf Cooperative Council, and actually work with them to take care of this issue that's in their backyards, which they should be taking care of themselves in the first place, and use the influence that we have from afar to help with the regional influence that they would have locally, because it is their issue. And so now you, of course, instead of hearing these attacks about Trump being Islamophobic, you hear that he's too close with the Saudis.
Yeah, that's an irony. Speaking of, like, I want to hit another part of foreign policy. So, you hot wars, and whether either in Syria or Afghanistan, but it looks like we're slowly getting an icy Cold War with China. And one of the things that's popped out recently is this coronavirus, and it looks like the Chinese attempts to cover it up, and then the ophthalmologist who found this is now dead, who supposedly caught the coronavirus. And my initial thought was, yeah, sure, right? Did they execute him? It sounds like the Communist Party leaders didn't do a successful job of covering this up, so they got whacked. Like, where did this come from? I mean, it was initially like bat soup and all of this, but you've been on this story. Where did Corona come from?
Yeah, so the latest we're seeing, and I actually was talking to someone who has a background in virology just earlier today, and he's preparing I guess a paper on this. And I asked him directly because he's got really no skin in the game in terms of partisanship, and he has just really a background looking at the science. The latest studies that he's seen come out on this thing, and again, we don't have a full sequence of it, so it's very hard to tell. China has been very cagey about the information that they're letting out in terms of not just the numbers, of course, that everyone looks at, but the actual makeup and composition of this virus, or the specific makeup of the virus. Every one of these is a mutation, a new mutation of some sort. But what he said is the latest information that he's looked at seems to be that this is something that occurred naturally within one or another animal species, then was able to gestate, and I'm totally going to get the science wrong, but then it traveled to another species that made it easier to come to contact and infect humans. And so that's picking up all these markers along the way that people can then track. So then when it crosses into humans, it becomes much easier, and this is because of close contact and everything else. So what he was saying was, for that entire sequence to happen, which you can see because every time it makes one of these stops, it's leaving markers within the actual sequence of the pathogen. It would be very hard to make something like that in a lab or as some sort of experiment, because that's not what a designer pathogen would look like. It's not what a biological weapon would look like. Those would look like it would be designed for a specific purpose, rather than something that had all this extra junk involved, right? And so the other angle that people are looking at is, could it be that this was something that China was studying, and then had it break loose on them? And that's also something that could potentially be a possibility, because again, they could be in close contact with the animals, it crosses over, boom, then you've got it everywhere, and China is a highly populated area, and so it spreads out. Again, that hasn't borne out, and so I honestly don't think we'll know to some extent where it exactly originated, just because of the nature of how China runs their system. But one thing that I did notice, and I did highlight and note, it took a lot of notice of when it first happened, was that Xi Jinping, through People's Daily, which is the mouthpiece of the party, right? China Daily is like, it's kind of like the official CNN. It's like the official narrative, but People's Daily is actually their newspaper that speaks with the mouth of the party. When you hear something coming out of there, you know it has the backing of the Chinese Communist Party, and that is the regime. Like, they're the regime's mouthpiece. And when Xi Jinping said anyone who is caught suppressing information about the Wuhan coronavirus is committing a sin against the people of China,
Yeah.
I suddenly realized that, well, a couple of things. Number one, that this became too big to contain. They knew that because of social media and everything else, that they had something absolutely massive on their hands and they wouldn't be able to contain it. And number two, that in Chinese, I guess just Eastern thought, they have this concept called the theory of dynastic cycles and dynastic decline. And there are some who have pointed to the Communist Party as just another type of dynasty or regime within China, the same way you would have the Qing dynasty, the Ming dynasty, etc., all the way back. And so the difference is that, you know, this one has 10-year leaders and then they switch over, at least they nominally do at this point. We'll see if Xi Jinping steps down after 10 years. Something tells me he won't. But the idea being that each dynasty is given something called the mandate of heaven. It rules through the mandate of heaven. That's why they don't have democracy. They don't have elections. They have the mandate of heaven. Well, how do you know you have the mandate of heaven without, someone voting for the just consent of the governed, right? As we would say in the West, just consent of the governed. Well, because they're the ones who won the last war. So they won the last war because they have the mandate of heaven. Well, how do you know they lose the mandate of heaven? And if you go back and through that theory of dynastic decline and dynastic cycles, pestilence, famine, and disease being afflicted throughout the country or afflicting the country were seen as signs that a regime had lost the mandate of heaven.
So it could be an
And
omen.
that's why I thought it was very interesting that Xi Jinping described this in terms of a sin. And at one point, he actually described it as the devil. He said, we are fighting the devil. So he's trying very hard to make sure that the people see this in terms of they still have the mandate of heaven and that you should not question the Chinese regime or the current dynasty because of this.
That's interesting. I heard you were talking about that in a different interview, and I guess coming from the West, I don't have a lot of experience with China. I've actually never been, but I've always, based on their their literature and a lot of what I've seen come out of their country, they've always seemed very irreligious. Like they're almost secular. Like Christianity is kind of getting popular out there right now. Like it's starting to make some inroads, but like mostly they always seem like a secular society. So what you're saying is no, that they do have these traditions that they can deem as supernatural.
And when I say mandate of heaven, I really don't mean that in a Western sense of heaven. I mean, they actually refer to it as the sky in Chinese, Tian. But it's this idea that the godly realm, if that makes sense. And there's many different conceptions of religion in China. I mean, obviously the Communist Party is atheist, but on a cultural level, there's Chinese cultural gods, there's Chinese Buddhism,
right,
which is an atheistic version of Buddhism. There's a very large, at least by Western standard, tens of millions growing Christian movement within China. However, I mean, tens of millions in China actually isn't even 1%. And they're very repressed. Another group you would have over there is Falun Gong, who's extremely repressed over in China. And so there are these religious movements that they try to keep down, but the ideas do tend to bubble over into society. And one of those deeply held Chinese, it's more of a cultural belief than a religious belief regarding dynastic decline and just the cycles. The theory
but is
of
that
cycles.
like just a form of
That makes
nationalism? Like in the Chinese,
In a sense.
Well, I mean, but in the East, I mean, they did, nature was revered, and you had sun gods and moon gods and all that. In Japan, you see this a lot. It's so it totally makes sense that China has natural, supernatural, natural, beings.
I mean, China was also a massive power back in the 1400s. They were exporting their culture. They had the massive armadas of Admiral Zhang, who was exporting Chinese culture all the way into Africa. Then they stop. They kind of go into a period of where they internal kind of seal off their borders, go into decline, or eventually colonize. But now they're back. And it seems like what they're doing is going into East Africa again, trying to manipulate other countries, give them loans.
Oh yeah, they're building roads in Kenya.
Yeah.
They're
But this is what they did this is what they would do in the 1400s: bring everyone back to the Forbidden City, make everyone fall in love with China, and then essentially have vassal states everywhere. Do you see that? What China's doing geopolitically now?
You're absolutely right in that. The word for China is a Western term. It's a European term. But in China, the way they refer to their country is Zhongguo. And that actually means the central kingdom, right? And so people will talk about Zhongguoism, this idea that they still view themselves very much as the central kingdom. And if you look at the history of Asia, by and large, they were the central kingdom for the entire sphere. And so when they first, prior to the Opium Wars in the 1800s, when they first came into contact with the West, there's this sort of apocryphal story that the emperor was told, so let me get this straight, your most powerful countries are this one that's only been around for like 100 years and they change their leader every 4 years. And the other one is some island that's ruled by a woman.
England.
Right.
That's great.
Yeah, well, and one of the things that
and then,
of
course, the British flooded them with opium, which, again, is another thing that they've copied.
I caught the interview you did with the Chinese journalists on the coronavirus, and, we talk about this could be naturally, it could have occurred naturally, but when you start arresting people that were making social media posts and and that, I mean, how do you not look more guilty than that? I mean,
welding people inside homes, welding doors shut. I mean, those Twitter clips that say everything.
Yeah, I mean, China is at this point really showing up to their, sort of the outsider image of China is almost exactly like what you're seeing now. And this idea that, you're locking people up for spreading harmful rumors on the internet. It's kind of chilling when you think about how Silicon Valley talks about Americans and Europeans today in terms of the policies that they want to put out across social media. One of the things you constantly hear in terms of politics is spreading harmful rumors, spreading misinformation. Well, when we know that one person's misinformation is another person's argument. I mean, you look how they're saying this with the Bernie Sanders supporters right now. And so seeing in China where the same government that controls social media controls essentially everything, that you can be locked up if your posts go too far, if your posts are and keep by the way, these original posts by that doctor you cited were actually just made in a private chat group.
Wow.
And then screenshots of those went viral on their social media, but he didn't even post it on social media. That's the crazy part.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, and he's just an ophthalmologist. He wasn't a virologist. He was just a local guy. So it's kind of a shame.
Yeah. And it's scary, too, because, communism, socialism, all that stuff, it's like become more top of mind. And, like a lot of young people in the West are promoting it more and more. And it's, it was kind of funny. So on HBO, there is a show, Chernobyl, which actually surprisingly did really well. A lot of people started watching it. I think for those that really aren't politically savvy or that are like, jacked into to the matrix, they saw that and they kind of saw what communism turns into, and now we're kind of seeing a live version of that with Corona, which I think is.
But this time it'll be different.
Yeah, right. This time it'll be different. So it's like, I don't know. You have to kind of see it.
And by the way, that same deal in Chernobyl, I didn't actually watch the show, but I just know the background. My wife is actually from Belarus, which is one of the main countries. It wasn't a country at the time, but it was the main areas that was affected by the fallout of Chernobyl. So it's around the border between Ukraine and Belarus. That it happened right around the Victory Day, or like the week before Victory Day, which is in early May. And so, because the government didn't tell anyone, Victory Day is like the biggest public parades and celebrations, and everyone goes outside, and the kids go out, and the veterans go out. And everyone holds these huge public displays. Well, actually, they were outside at the time that this fallout was hitting, and the government didn't want to cancel all that because they knew how bad it would look publicly, and so they just let everyone go out and get contaminated.
Yeah, Yeah,
Jeez.
and again, an attempt to cover this up. When they didn't have the proper safety protocols in place, this would, Chernobyl couldn't have happened in America. This wouldn't have happened at Davis Bessie in Toledo, for example. It just when you don't have the proper shielding. So it's just, this is communism. Just, I think.
Oh, excuse me. I've just been passed a note by my lovely producer here. Chernobyl took place on April 26th. May 1st is the Labor Day parade. Labor Day is really big in communism. And then May 9th is Victory Day, which is kind of what they refer to as the
VE
World War
Day.
II.
Yeah.
Yeah, and in the
VE Day.
Yeah, and in the show, like they did show like people standing outside watching it, like standing in the ashes. I mean, obviously they had to recreate a lot of that stuff. Who knows? But I mean,
but so
scary.
The kind of the opium wars in China are like a good segue over to like what's happening on the border. So you have like cartel madness and shipping a ton of drugs in here, which is, and you mentioned this, like the drug problem, not just cartel violence, but the drug problem is one of the reasons why we really have to get control of the border. Like, can you expand on that? Because I think that sounds like one of the reasons that these third rail issues that Trump's talking about.
Yeah, so the precursors for a lot of the fentanyl, which is coming through, that's fueling what's referred to as the opioid crisis. If you watch Breaking Bad, you can see a whole lot of that, is coming through China. And China absolutely knows what they're doing. They 100% are clear what they're doing, and they know why they're doing it as well. I mean, this idea that, people are asking for it, so we're just supplying a need. I mean, it's ridiculous. They're taking the heartland of America and getting them drugged up. They want this health crisis. They want this public crisis on America's hands, because in one way, and people will then sometimes say to me, but Jack, wasn't it the British who supplied the opium to China, not the Americans? Well, you got to understand that from their perspective, we're all just the West, right? We're all just the Westerners. So yeah, Britain was the hegemon back then. We're the hegemon now. So to them, it's.
Is China invested in the cartels? Because I thought this is kind of a Mexican crime gang making a lot of money that doesn't care. But you mentioned China. How are they involved?
Right, precisely. So China's in on it because they know that they can make money off of it, and because it suits their overall goals. It suits their overall and they have a 100-year plan that they're working on. America can't seem to plan 1 year in advance, or at least past the next election.
Well, it's like a game of civilization, right? You get to continue to control the society throughout hundreds of years.
Right. So in this perspective, the cartels just become a useful accomplice to furthering those needs. If the cartels weren't there, would they try to find another way? Yes, but it would be a lot harder for China to do so. So that's why taking action against the cartels. And by the way, that's not going to be a very easy thing to do, because people understand the cartels aren't just on the borders. The cartels control vast amounts of territory within Mexico.
Yeah.
I've talked to some folks who are working specifically on the borders and on this issue, and they've said you can't just declare the cartels terrorist organizations. That is, they'll start attacking, and they're going to attack within the United States as well, because they have assets here. So the main thing that the United States could start doing is looking at the banks. HSBC, back during the Obama administration, during those years, was totally blown up that HSBC was laundering money for the cartels, laundering money for Hezbollah, laundering money for the IRGC, and vast amounts of other criminal networks. And they got like a slap on the wrist. They had to pay like a day's worth of profits or revenue. And then James Comey comes in and parachutes there and helps them fix all their compliance issues. And they just keep going on doing the same kind of stuff. And so this idea that U.S. banks are actually facilitating the financial networks of these cartels is really the choke point that any administration, whether it be Trump or whoever, if they wanted to get very serious about this, they would have to take a look at it. So you start going after the money, and somehow if they start not being able to actually access their money, then how are they going to be able to pay the people that are going back and forth, et cetera, et cetera? Now you're actually affecting them, because you round up a couple of coyotes here, you take out a couple of leaders there, you're not actually attacking the problem systemically. And that's the way you've got to look at it, because they're always going to be able to find a replacement.
And since Trump's an outsider, is he taking a different approach to this?
I think so. I think he's not really looking at it from a perspective of how do we help with the feelings of everyone who's involved, or what's the political ramifications of going after a certain group or another. I think he really is just looking at issues in the country. I think he was going off about, water pressure when you flush your toilet
Yeah.
and in the closet, which is true, by the way. A lot of that was changed about 10 years ago to introduce more air. I literally looked this up. They introduced more air into it. The copper pipes didn't used to do that. And so this idea that we're using more water because we have these, they're called mixing valves in our water supply, that if you weren't someone who was older like the president, which he is, you may not notice it because we're just used to that sort of sound when you turn the water on. But if you go to an older home that still has the copper piping, if you're visiting grandparents or something like that, you'll notice that it's not like that. It's quiet, it's clear, and the pressure is much stronger. So he just has this sort of mind where he's looking at things from a very outside perspective and saying, hey, this is a problem. How do we fix the problem?
Yeah.
Rather than, reading the newspaper and trying to, deal with equitable shareholders and stakeholders in different situations.
Is the wall going to get built? And do you think that that's like a central issue to a lot of Trump voters? And Ann Coulter is certainly making the case that it is. What's your stance?
I did a panel with Ann about this down in Florida recently, Brandon Arby. And I think at this point, if the wall doesn't get built, then a lot of those core Trump supporters are going to leave, or they're just going to check out, because it did sort of become the central issue of Trump's campaign, and it changed the conversation that everybody was having about the border and the way they had it about the border. But at the same time, we were just talking about opioids. The wall isn't the end all be all. So while the wall does need to be completed, and certainly there are areas like Nogales, Texas, Nogales, Arizona, not far from where I was stationed at Fort Huachuca a couple times for training, for human intelligence training. They're broad areas that are just completely open in the high desert, where you can walk across, and it's a complete humanitarian disaster that because these areas are open and it's a high desert, people cross through it. I mean, you've got folks that are trying to go on these treks. Nobody knows what's going on out there. There's completely no oversight, obviously. That's where you get these women getting assaulted. That's where you find people just dying while they're trying to make this trek across. I mean, it's a complete humanitarian disaster. It's almost a 21st century trail of tears. I know that phrase has been used by the administration. So you shut that stuff down, you're going to shut down the incentive for people to try to cross it. But secondly, since we were talking about opioids, a lot of that does come over ports of entry. A lot of that does come through legal ports of entry. So talking about just whether driving or by sea. And so those are ways in which you have to attack these systemic issues, and it's not just a wall issue or an enforcement issue.
Well, and I'm with you on as far as going after the money. I think that's exactly what we need to do, and part of that is legalizing some of these drugs. Obviously marijuana is legal now. The government still isn't taking their cut of that, which is ridiculous in my opinion. I don't know what your opinion is on it, Jack. But it's funny, like once you start going after them, they have to look at different ways. So like avocados now are going to be the next drug war with Mexico. We're seeing the cartels kidnap farmers and take over the avocado production, and it's insane. So
one of the best lines that I heard, and I've got to give credit to Brandon Darby, is we need to stop treating Mexico like it's a Western European nation and start treating it like it is a narco state, because that's what it is, right? It's basically like Afghanistan on our border, but without the Islam.
Or is Panama a good, like Noriega's Panama? Is that a reasonable facsimile?
Gosh, maybe, but I wouldn't necessarily call AMLO a dictator.
Okay, all right, fair enough.
Yeah,
but you're saying still that the politicians have a lot of cartel. There's cartel influence over the politicians, right? There's a swamp in Mexico, so yeah, it's not a dictatorship.
Over the politicians, over law enforcement, over swaths of the military. I mean, it's so deep that anyone passing a law or making some pithy gesture, it's not going to be enough, right? It's not going to be enough.
Right. So that's fair to
make the argument, and I didn't go down this road too much, but in that same panel we talked about, if America is going to be doing any nation building anywhere in the world, you'd think we do it in the one that's in our backyard.
Yeah.
Yeah. And the way to help, I think a point was made. I watched that panel, that maybe the best way to help, because conservatives care about the refugees. There's people that saying, they could care less about the brown people, but is allowing them to just flee and just come into America without citizenship, without papers, the best thing for them, or is helping them in their own countries, in fact, not the best humanitarian thing for them?
Yeah, in fact, a lot of conservatives I saw were very gung-ho on the president saying, oh, we should declare cartels terrorist organizations. But I said, hold on a second, guys, because the cartels control areas within Mexico. So if you say that an area of Mexico is then controlled by a group that you designated a terrorist organization, now everyone inside that area is going to be able to use your designation to claim war refugee status inside the United States, because it's going to trigger those laws. Yeah. And now that's going to be like a free pass for them to come into the U.S. So it's like a be careful what you wish for kind of situation.
Well, and it's interesting because, you know, I understand the DNC and all the candidates need to be the stark opposite of Trump, because that's what they're pretty much all running on. But this conversation of completely open borders, I think it's scaring the apolitical people, the people that, again, you know, like the everyday people. When they start hearing that stuff, that freaks them out. I think they would totally be on board with aid, humanitarian efforts to help people in their countries, and, you know, like to rebuild that. But when you start talking about like no borders, I think that freaks out a lot of people, even Democrat voters.
Well, I mean, the basic line, and it's been said before, is how can you have a welfare state and open borders? How can you just logically or consistently, as a reasonable, objective person, say that you want both of those things?
Yeah. And it's weird. Now, you see a lot of people on the left saying nobody's for open borders. No one's for open borders. Yet, when AOC was out stumping for Bernie out in Iowa, she said that the part of the Bernie Sanders campaign is to get rid of ICE and get rid of Border Patrol. That now, I don't know if that's part of Bernie's campaign, but someone's lying. You know, so
yeah, precisely. Whenever someone says, "Oh, I'm not for open borders," okay, so what's your limit? Right? Yeah. What is your number for immigrants, legal immigrants, on a yearly basis that you would have come in? And here's what's interesting is if they can't give you a specific number, or at least to say some type of system that they would put in place, then by default, they're for open borders.
Mm-hmm. No.
Yeah, that's true.
Jack, did you happen to catch the John Oliver bit on Medicare for All?
No, I didn't see that.
Yeah, I watched some of it. I know it was making a lot of waves. You know, and a lot of people that are on board with that plan really loved it. But, you know, even his argument, it still hinges on the fact that the government is in a position to negotiate contracts and control costs and get things done in a timely manner. And, you know, coming from someone from the outside, you know, and the
yeah, if there's anything the government does, it's take care of things at the time.
Exactly. I mean, they literally go out of business. Well, you know, they can't operate anymore because they run out of money. Like, why do we think the government can control something this, you know, this confusing? And I'm not saying our system's perfect. I'm not saying that, but is putting it in the hands of the government really going to make it better? Like, when has that ever happened?
Which, by the way, you go look at the UK right now, and the NHS is, I mean, and this has been out, WikiLeaks reported on this, that they're having conversations about how to turn over management of the NHS to private companies and private healthcare companies to bring in pharma. They're doing everything they can to not publicly say privatize the NHS, but internally they're having these conversations because they know it's just not working.
Yeah.
Well, I can tell you this much. I mean, I sell medical devices to hospitals, and price-wise, as far the hospitals are the ones footing the bill for this. Ultimately, it falls on insurance, but hospitals negotiate the prices, and not everyone pays the same. The private hospitals do a better job of controlling prices than the VA.
Of course.
I know this for a fact.
Yeah, that's a great point.
So I mean, that's goes back to what I was talking about with the military-industrial complex, right? The DoD is typically paying 4 times more for anything that they're purchasing than you would just in the free market. I mean, you hear about these $600 toilets and, you know, the $200 hammers and stuff like that.
Yeah. Well, and also too, I mean, if you've met anyone that's worked in the government, even on low level, it's like it's like a joke. You can't get fired from there. I mean, like,
which by the way, it is that specific reason and some others, but that specific reason that I do believe that Jeffrey Epstein killed himself.
Interesting. Can you elaborate?
The guards were asleep. They were hanging out on Google and eBay. They were looking up the scores on ESPN. The cameras weren't working properly. Procedures weren't being followed. Go down the list, man.
That's
records.
Yeah, that's a great point. That's a great point. Yeah.
Sounds like every federal facility I've ever had experience with whatsoever.
I know. There's no incentive to meet your deadlines. There's no incentive to cut costs. There's no incentive to try and keep your budgets in line. There's no incentive for private companies have this incentive because obviously the bottom line is what you're looking at, and you have to cut the fat every once in a while, and you have to stay profitable. And the government doesn't care.
But it's the rules. I mean, I'm not disparaging. I mean, the people that work at the VA are great people.
Oh,
but
and I'm not saying that.
They're limited by all of the regulations that they have to do. They can't work like a private entity and say, hey, we're going to kind of flip it upside down and have done a great job. They can't do the same thing.
Private entities have to worry about going out of business and like permanently. The government doesn't.
No.
You know, everyone is like, oh,
this is why I laugh when people get all mad because Trump was trying to do something and then he gets the procedure wrong, and he just calls somebody, like he just calls up the president of Ukraine and says, "Hey, can you take care of this? These people on my end are screwing around." He's like, "Well, sure, you can't even ask him." What do you mean I can't ask him? I pick up the phone, I call the guy, I ask him, solve the problem.
That's a great point because that's how it gets done in the private world. You just take initiative and you can cut through the. I mean, I know there's still politics. I'm in a big company, big corporation. There's still politics, but you can still cut through it, and. The government. People.
When I was in the military, even at the level I was at, but I did have the opportunity to lead a task force at one point, and I had people working under me on the intel side, and I kept telling them that yes, make sure you have an email trail just so you can have something to point to, but if you want to actually get anything done, you need to relearn or rediscover the lost art of picking up the phone.
Yep.
Dialing someone's number and having a conversation with another human.
That's right.
Well, and it seems like when you're working with
Brian's in sales, he knows that.
Yeah, but a personal. But Reagan had a personal relationship with Gorbachev, even though sometimes these countries are not necessarily your best friends.
Right.
This is what leads to détente. This is what leads to better relations, and maybe even the undoing of a communist country in Russia's case.
Sometimes détente is good. Chris Murphy just had this. There's this huge scandal going on right now where Chris Murphy had to publicly admit that he was having private meetings with the Iranian leadership, and they finally hit him with it. Why would you do that? Why would you do that? And he said, well, sometimes we have to have relations with people even if we don't like it. And he said, that's exactly what you were going after Trump and Russia for all these years. It's the exact same stuff.
Yeah, and I'm so sick of hearing about Russia. Like China's the one that scares the shit out of me. Like Russia, come on, like. Yeah, they do some crazy shit and they hack and they, whatever. But China's scary as shit.
Is there anyone who actually thinks that Russia presents a existential threat to the United States?
I don't know. It's a great question.
Like, unless you're like just the biggest Cold Warrior, dinosaur, Tom Clancy, diehard kind of guy. Like, I just don't think that there's anyone looking at the situation. I mean, Putin can barely maintain control within Russia. His Syria deployment is extremely unpopular with the Russian people, but he's been able to maintain legitimacy through pointing out the needs to maintain that war memorial port in Tartus and Latakia, the sort of Eastern Mediterranean port that they refurbished from the Soviet times. But the idea that Russia is some like global powerhouse about to take over the world, I mean, it's just not true. It's just not even possible.
Yeah, I think the only way they're a threat is if they team up with China.
Well, it's like we're doing everything we can to drive them into each other's arms.
Right.
Well,
exactly.
right. Yeah, Pakistan.
There's a situation where we have three. If anyone's read 1984, right? Remember the situation there. There's the
Oceania, East Asia
against the other one.
Yeah, there was Oceania, East Asia, and something else.
Eurasia.
Yes.
No.
Yeah. So it's okay. So Oceania and Eurasia align against East Asia.
No.
Wait. No. Now we're at war with Eurasia, and we've always been at war. That's just awesome. Great. I mean, speaking of like that kind of like, what would a Bernie Sanders presidency mean? Like we asked the question on Twitter.
Oh yeah. That's a question.
We
first.
we said, is there a substantive difference between socialism and democratic socialism?
I mean, there's a difference in terms of, I think, sales tactics. I mean, you mentioned sales before. You know, there's a meme about this where socialism is like a boot going down on a group of people, and the other one is like a boot going down, but it's like a purple boot with rainbows and
Yeah, we got that meme.
Yeah, we
in
got that
response
one.
to that.
It's got sprinkles, right?
And sprinkles, of course.
Yeah. So,
but do you think? I mean,
well, if they would try to make the argument. This is the Stalinist versus Trotskyist argument, right? Mm-hmm. That Stalin was an authoritarian who was imposing socialism, whereas Trotsky wanted to introduce reforms that allowed for consent of the governed as they introduced socialism.
Okay, but let's take it in this way. You mentioned, and it was interesting in one of your interviews, you mentioned populism is about holding people accountable. And drain the swamp is a bit of a metaphor for this.
100%.
Right, but on the Bernie side, they kind of do the same thing. Occupy Wall Street. What about the bankers and the holding people accountable?
A lot of populist energy in my Bernie bros.
Yeah. So, but where do you what points do you have the Venn diagram overlap with them, and where do you differ?
Yeah. So I mean, this is similar with Ralph Nader back in the day, right? The Venn diagram is very much in terms of we agree by and large with what the problems in society are. We've identified and really clued in on this disparity between the elites and everyone else. It's in the U.S. the Civil War, right? It was the North versus the South. Well, that's not where the split is today. Today, it's cities versus everyone else. You could say city versus rural, but it really is just sort of the outside of the cities. And so the disparity is in this gap is absolutely massive. But you can look at things like Bernie Sanders not supporting TPP. President Trump did not support TTP. They have supported different tactics in terms of really trade is probably the biggest one that you've seen on this. They're pro-worker, we're pro-worker. The difference I would see is they're all about punishing companies, punishing corporations, punishing bankers, whereas we'd like to simply see reforms, regulation. If somebody commits fraud, they should go to jail. There's no question about that. And there was a ton of that in the credit crisis, 07, 08. There's a ton of people on Wall Street that they got away with it. They completely got away with it. Barack Obama didn't care. Tim Geithner, of course, wasn't going to do anything to any of those guys. Eric Holder didn't do anything to those guys. They completely got away with everything they were doing. Everyone was cooking the books on that, and they knew it, right? And the Bush administration was in on it, and the Obama administration. They both didn't pass. And so the Venn diagram is solutions. I think the Venn diagram is this idea that, all right, we don't want to blow up society and drastically replace it with something new, but we want to get society back to where it was kind of prior to the 1990s or so.
Interesting.
So,
or to the 90s, if you put it that way.
Are you focusing more on like culture, or like what reforms do you want to see?
Well, one of the greatest reforms when you mention culture that I think is coming up through the Trump administration right now is this idea that an executive order stating that all public federal buildings will move away from brutalism and instead embrace classic architecture. I think that is absolutely something that the federal government should be doing. I think it's going to be something that's an 80-20 issue if the president does end up signing it. And I think it's something that's really going to change the way that we think about our government, the way that our government works. We talked about the depressing, soulless nature of government. When you look at any of those structures, they're all depressing and soulless to drive by. I walk to work every morning past them, but it's just horrific. You look at these eyesores. The J. Edgar Hoover building is a great example of that. But then it's right across the street from the Justice Department, which is actually a very nice classical building. And so these ideas that we should be not just having this government that exists as sort of some sort of behemoth blob going back to like Wilsonian progressivism, but actually we should have this vibrant republic that we're able to use, that was bequeathed to us by our founding fathers for our own betterment. That's something that we want to actually teach, not just one side or another, but to every American citizen, that these are there for your benefit and for your good. That's why law exists, is to make your lives better, not to control and lord over you.
Yeah, like just that subtle pro-America statement. It seems like the New York Times with their 1619 project is the anti-American statement, completely redefining America.
Did you get
no, what they want to do is they want to, and you see this with the original sin-ism, right? Talking about, well, America was flawed from its start. Mm-hmm. America had an issue, and that's why we really can't look back at America's his history unless we look at it in terms of with a critical eye, a critical stance. And it's ridiculous. I think everybody knows that you can't judge the past by modern moral standards, right? You can't go back to the Middle Ages and talk about the morality of the system of alliances or how princesses were treated. We consider that like sex slavery in this day and age. But it's this idea that you can't really define someone's morals in a different time and place by the moral standards that we have today, which, by the way, the moral standards that we have today may change. They seem to be changing every 5 minutes. If you talk to anyone on the woke left, something that you said 5 minutes ago is completely, grounds for cancellation.
Yes.
But then in 10 minutes later, the next thing is going to be grounds for cancellation. Yep. It's kind of amazing watching them sort of eat their own over this lately.
Yeah, no, and that's a good point. So Jack's going to be in Milwaukee for the Better Discourse Conference, where we're bringing a ton of different people, and your panel is a time to cancel culture.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, have you seen kind of a shift? So, obviously, well, we started as an atheist organization, and in the 2001, there's a big boom with atheism and the big push and Dawkins.
Post 9/11.
Post 9/11 is like Harris, and there's like a community that was built around it. And we started noticing probably like 4 or 5 years ago this major split in it based on kind of some of the stuff we see with cancel culture and some of the woke stuff we're seeing. And now we're seeing these weird alliances come out. Like we're seeing Peter Boghossian talking to an evangelical organization. We're seeing major figures that are bonding on just having conversations and dialogue and, kind of rebelling against those that are trying to cancel everyone. Are you kind of seeing a shift in this?
I think it's that, people are finding I'm Roman Catholic, right? You're finding people who have common cause because there's this strain of cultural cancer that's going through the United States, and it cuts across every movement. It cuts across so much of our society. It's this gotcha culture that, I got you, now I can ruin your life because of something you posted on Facebook when you were in high school. It's ridiculous. It's insane. People are losing their lives over it. Families are being destroyed over it. People are being driven to suicide over it. There was I don't want to get this wrong, but it was a young conservative who committed suicide over getting canceled. I was a college student, and it's absolutely insane the lengths to which it's gone. And so I really commend you guys for putting together this Better Discourse summit, which I really think is what it is. Hopefully, Milwaukee isn't going to be as raucous as Philadelphia was in 2016 or
with the
Chicago
DNC
was in 1968, depending on what happens with the delegates. I certainly hope not, because Milwaukee's a lovely town. I just visited there for the first time. I saw you guys. But what a great city. By the way, why did you guys not tell me how great Milwaukee was? What are you doing? You're hiding it.
Yeah. No, it's
want to blow you away.
Yeah, it's really good in the summer. In the winter, it's not
totally
so much
fun. I'm an East Coast guy. I'm the Philly kid, right? I'm Philadelphia, New York, Baltimore, DC, Boston. Those are my stomping grounds. And we love to be very elitist and think that we're completely the best of the entire country, obviously. But then I get out to Milwaukee and I'm like, this is a great town.
Yeah. No, it is great. And one of the nice things is it's not as triggered, I guess. It doesn't get as triggered as, some of the other cities. And we've operated in other cities, Manhattan, places like that. If you're bringing conservative speakers or even just, people that are libertarian, if they're not woke, people freak out. And, that's a nice thing about Milwaukee. It actually is it's tolerant to a lot of different.
There's a
ideas.
Midwest chill.
Yeah, there
for
really
lack
is.
of a better word.
There really
Totally.
is.
Yeah, no, I was gonna do an event in Philadelphia. Or I was doing an event in Philadelphia a couple of years ago, and I saw some like Antifa events or accounts on Twitter saying we're gonna let Jack Posobiec know he's not welcome in Philadelphia. I'm like, bro, I'm literally from Philadelphia.
Yeah, right. Well, they were there when you were there last year, and they were they were there too. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Exactly. These people are, these people aren't welcome. Like, no, like I'm from here. Like,
yeah.
like I went to school right there. You can see,
But I think it's backfiring. Like I think they're taking
It is.
They're taking these ridiculous steps, and they're creating allies of people that typically wouldn't be in the same space, and I don't think it's going to last for them. I think they're.
So what's also interesting is that, and I was looking into the situation with Aubrey Huff. He's this World Series player who just got canceled by his team for going to a reunion for the San Francisco Giants, and people were saying, "Well, Jack, he's not just a Trump supporter. He's got some mean tweets." And I said, well, "What are the mean tweets?" And I look up
the volleyball,
like one's a joke about Iran, and one's like some. I couldn't even tell you what all they were, but I looked through them and I'm like, they were just dumb jokes, right? And so what I thought was interesting, though, is I took it a step back and I say, is social media changing human nature?
Yeah.
Or is the situation that human nature is itself immutable? I believe that human nature is immutable. If you're a student of history, you'll see this.
Yeah.
But that social media is presenting a mirror to society in a mass perception that no one has ever seen before, and certainly it's both a telescope and a magnifying glass on not just the great and powerful, but also the regular citizens, just any civilian, and it's this really interesting situation, this dynamic that we socially haven't really caught up with yet.
Yeah.
We don't know what it's like. South Park did an episode on this, that everyone's emails got leaked at the same time or something. Social media is kind of like that.
Yeah. Well, it
turns out, guess what? Apparently everyone actually is, in fact, human.
Yeah. Well, and it's the socially acceptable addiction. It's really become this addiction that people are like patting each other on the back for. And, we've seen stories, Instagram models, people that live on social media. I mean, this is all a show. I think it's in Russia. There's companies that you can pay where they'll like put you on a jet and they'll take pictures of you for your Instagram. That. Yeah. So, I mean, but it's a social addiction. So I think it's influential to a small percentage of the population, but that small percentage is very loud, and
by the way, we don't even know how this is affecting people as they grow up.
Yeah.
I mean, my son's 1.5 years. I have no idea what his mental wiring is going to be completely changed and altered by growing up with social media. That's why I actually disagree with a lot of people when they try to say that if people who were born in the 80s are millennials. I completely disagree with that categorization. I fight this every day on Twitter. Because if you were born in the 80s, that means you were part of that last generation to have a childhood that was completely analog.
Kick the can
into the machine.
Yep.
You rode bikes, you hung out with your friends.
We had Nintendo and Sega. That was it.
We had Nintendo and Sega. Hey, Sonic the Hedgehog is #1 at the box office.
Yeah.
So but this idea that, and then the internet sort of grew up as we grew up.
Yeah.
But that a millennial is someone that's in the same bucket as you. No way. Like the social difference, the social impact of constant digital communication and connectivity is so vast that yes, it is a short amount of time. It's only 10 years versus 10 years. But I fundamentally think it changed at least the character and personality of those generations. That you do have a split from people who were born in the 80s to people who were born in the 90s.
Well, and it's not life, and I think a lot of people live on it so much that like there's 330 million Twitter users, and that's the 4% of the world's population. I mean, it's such a
best 4%. No.
Yeah, but and even in that 4%, how many active users are there? I mean, it's really it's a lot of loud people that utilize it all the time, and so it's like. It's a very small percentage of people that are starting to become like these.
Well, people are starting to learn
arbiters.
this through politics, right?
Yeah.
They're starting to learn that Twitter is not real life. And
yeah.
That's sort of a refrain that you're hearing again and again now. You saw this in the UK where Labor thought that they were going to clean up in these last elections, and they got smoked. They got absolutely smoked. 2016, it happened with the Trump election. You know, Hillary got smoked. She thought she, no, I won't say smoked. She lost, but she didn't lose by that much. And so you're now starting to see that again, because in the Democrat primaries, you're seeing people who have tons of online support go down in flames in the primaries. People are shifting alliances, people, as you said on the other dynamic, because you're finding out that these candidates, that just because they have large online presence doesn't necessarily mean that they have a physical presence. Now, the Bernie, and I love Bernie Bros for this, because it's just, I love the dissent. I love dissenters, right? Dissidents. That. So there's this joke that Pete Buttigieg is like the corporate champ, and I always call it, mayor cheat, right? It's like in wrestling, right? We do a heel turn, right? So they've gone from being like a good guy to a bad guy. And so,
which Trump was in, by the way. But, yeah,
of course, Trump is. I mean, he's obviously a heel, right? But so Buttigieg has all of these like accounts just throughout Twitter that seem like they're bots. They seem like they're fake. And so, it'll be like, longshoreman for Buttigieg. Like, what? Find me the longshoreman for Buttigieg, And so Bernie supporters are now making troll accounts to make fun of those. So the one that got really big recently was Zookeepers for Pete. they were having Zookeepers for Pete come out, but then they trolled a little bit too hard over some Ryan Newman stuff, the NASCAR driver, and they got kind of found out. But it's just this ridiculousness of a guy that has a ton of money from Silicon Valley, and suddenly he seems to be getting all these votes through some kind of app that apparently he has ties to, the DNC has ties to, but nobody's heard of him across. But again, Bernie Bros, you got to remember, Twitter's not real life.
It really isn't, and it's good to take a break from it, And I give a lot of credit to people that can handle it. I mean, I'm on there sometimes. Brian's been on there more, but it takes an emotional toll on you because people are nuts. Like they really, once you give them anonymity, man, they'll just say some of the darkest, twisted stuff.
Oh yeah,
it's unhealthy.
Yeah, no doubt.
It's super unhealthy.
I was to end, I thought, do you want to make a prognostication or prediction? Who's going to be up against? We're going to assume Trump's going to win his primary, right? Against Bill Weld or whoever's running. Who do you think? Who's coming out of the Democratic side?
So the beauty of it is that nobody really knows right now. But I'll say this: the dynamic is the Death Star of Michael Bloomberg versus the rebel alliance of the Bernie Bros, right? And so in Star Wars, of course, they blow up the Death Star, and then the rebels take over. But if you take the Star Wars, if you include the prequels, the rebels are never really able to maintain power over the galaxy, and so another Death Star kind of comes in, another empire comes in, not to give any legitimacy to the sequel trilogy because it doesn't deserve it, but just the same as I would say with anything pretty much that J.J. Abrams touches. But it's a really crazy dynamic, and nobody really knows what's going to happen in Milwaukee. So that's why I'm so excited to actually be coming out, not just for the Better Discourse Summit, but also just to see what actually happens on the ground, because we could be going to a brokered DNC. And in a brokered DNC, I mean, they could go. I mean, clearly Bloomberg is trying to buy off the party. He said, "Look, I've got the money, I've got the the establishment credentials." He actually said something negative about trans rights. In an interview that's coming up. So he's like, "Look, I'm not part of the woke crowd. Come with me. I'm Mr. Acela Corridor technocrat, and I've got the money to pay off everybody. Let's just do this."
Yeah.
Right. And it's like I don't know. He's like trying to pimp himself to the DNC.
The Bernie Bros are not going to vote for him. There's just no way. I mean, that Bloomberg goes in there, like the Bernie Bros are not voting for a billionaire, I don't think.
Right, but what's interesting is that we haven't seen. So Bloomberg is everything that they said Trump was. Right. He literally is just spending gobs of money on American politics in a way
Yep.
that has never been seen. Right?
Yeah.
Bloomberg could pay to open a steel mill in the Midwest.
Yep.
He could just do that.
Yep.
He could buy Twitter and kick Donald Trump off of it. Right?
Yep.
He's got money to do things that nobody has even conceptualized yet.
Yeah.
And so when you have that kind of money to play around with, yeah, the ads are one thing, but if he turns into the business realm and actually starts providing jobs as a candidate, why not? He's got the money to do so.
Yeah. Well, he can do Andrew Yang was proposing just out of his own bank account, huh? Just $1,000 a month to everyone. Give me the election.
You could even hire Andrew Yang to do it.
He could. Well, Jack, thank you so much for coming on, man. We love having you on. So excited to have you in Milwaukee. You're going to be at a Night for Freedom next week, right?
Yeah, so Night for Freedom is going down next week. It's sort of a CPAC after party. Like Cernovich is holding it. I know Fleckis is going to be there. Carpe Diem, just a ton of really, really cool people. It's a great vibe. I don't know if there's any specific speakers that are going to be done this year. We try to actually keep it sort of light on the speaking and high on just the cool vibes.
That's what people love.
Good time.
Yeah.
We want to bring in Milk and Cooks again, the DJs out of Chicago, and just keep it a really cool party atmosphere and make it so people can mingle, so people can network and set up a few different experiences, have some good food. But it'll be great. I hope to see you guys there.
Yeah, we'll be there too. It's funny, Brian and I are going to CPAC. I personally never thought I'd say that in my life. Melissa Chen speaking too. Yeah. Melissa's going to be there, so I'm looking forward. I mean, the registration process for CPAC alone was nuts. I mean, like the photo thing you have to do.
Then to sign over the firstborn.
It's like oh,
did you register as media?
No, just regular attendee. Yeah, and like you had to take a picture of yourself. You had to get a
retinal
number.
scan.
You had to do all this stuff. Fingerprints. I'm sure it'll be when we get there.
In the future, when China runs everything, I mean, they'll just know already. You just speak out loud. I want to go to CPAC, and then the systems just go from there.
Yeah, I figure I'm first against the wall anyway.
But that's what it's all about. I think me going. I'm very apolitical. I'm not like right left. I'm not loyal to anyone really. Brian more on the right. We have people that are all over the place in our organization. But it's gonna be good to go just to hear different perspectives and different people and. Have some discussions. That's what it's all about, and that's why I'm excited for a Night for Freedom.
Yeah, walking the floor at CPAC, and I'm not to publicly throw any shade at them, but people have a great experience just walking the floor at CPAC itself, aside from the speakers, just who they run into, who's on media row, who shows up, and that's actually, believe it or not, where Donald Trump got his start. He sort of was a surprise speaker at CPAC in 2011. I happened to be there. He and his entourage walked right past me in the hallway. This was back when they used to do it at the Omni Showroom. Now they do it at the Gaylord in National Harbor, Maryland. But he wasn't even on the schedule. It was actually, believe it or not, it was an LGBT Republican group that brought him in.
Wow.
And funny enough, very just cool political fact for you guys. Do you know, or I'll ask, who introduced, it's a currently serving politician, who introduced Donald Trump at his first CPAC speech?
Ooh, Brian, this is more you gotta shoot out a guess.
But if it was coming in, I don't know if there's I don't know.
Ted Cruz.
Oh,
how funny.
Isn't that crazy?
That is crazy. That's crazy.
Wow, it's totally wild. What? But you go back and watch the video, and there's a young Ted Cruz introducing Donald Trump at his first major political speech.
I know we're over time. I want to ask you one more question, Jack. Do you think, let's say things were reversed, do you think Trump would have ran as a Democrat if things were reversed?
I don't know. I think he's certainly been gravitating towards that, but I don't think that he's a businessman at the end of the day, and the populace. So he moved. People pointed out, they say, well, Trump moved into the Tea Party and kind of took up their flag and became their champion, even though he was never, this like hard arch conservative in the past, right? And so while there was a populist Occupy movement going on the left, he never really fit that mold because he's a billionaire, and you can't really be on the populist left as a billionaire. No matter how many steaks you eat with ketchup and how many times you go to McDonald's, they're just not going to accept you.
What about George Soros? Doesn't he count?
Well, it is funny noting the hypocrisies, numerous hypocrisies.
There's one exception. He's the only one that I can think of.
No.
Right, but because he's woke, right? Because he's woke, and that so as long as he's woke, and you can do whatever you want. You could be the CEO of the Giants was on film.
He can buy his indulgences.
Throwing his wife on the ground, taking her cell phone, and they reinstated him. He was suspended for like a couple of months.
Wow.
But you have some controversial mean tweets, so ban for life.
Well, Brian, I'll let you close it out.
That was really good. Well, check him out. It's Jack Posobiec if you haven't watched him. You can cajole your cable company to get One American News. That's the little plug. I think I love your guys' ads. But, Jack, you can find some of his stuff on YouTube, too. It's definitely good to talk to you. Appreciate the perspective. Can't wait to see you in Milwaukee.
Appreciate it, guys. Have a great night.
All right, take care.